SBC Media.
Welcome to iGaming Daily, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe. Supported by SBC Summit Latino America, bringing together the leadership teams and product specialists from retail and online operators in Latin American markets.
Discover the potential of Latin America's booming iGaming and sports betting markets at SBC Summit Latin America, the premier industry event in the region. Join SBC at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Miami from October 31st to November the 2nd. Register now at sbcevents.com.
Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Queen asked simple enough questions, but the current hot topic in the gambling industry is where the line is between sports betting and fantasy sports. As second mover fantasy sites like Underdog and Prize Picks have gained a loyal following of players with prop-style fantasy games, a wave of states are taking closer looks at how they define the daily fantasy sports category. SBC Americas spoke with Underdog CEO Jeremy Levine about the assault on Underdog, and he pointed the finger squarely at FanDuel and DraftKings. Today on iGaming Daily, we're going to discuss Levine's comments and run down the latest developments in the DFS saga in the United States. I'm Jessica Welman, editor of SBC Americas, joined by senior journalist for SBC Americas, Charlie Horner. Did you miss me, Charlie? It's been a minute since we've gotten to do this.
Yeah, you took some time off and left us. I missed you a lot.
Thanks.
We had a good interview, but nothing beats just the two of us.
Yeah, it's true. And although I will say, if you guys haven't gone and listened to your interview with, is it Jeremy Albrecht?
Justin
Albrecht. Jeremy is who we're talking to today. My bad. Justin Albrecht about the MGM cybersecurity hack. For someone who needs it in plain language, that was exactly the listen that I needed for an explanation of exactly what went on. So just keep that in mind. To go back and listen. But I'm also going to plug this. We have a really good interview on SBC Americas that went live today that we're going to be talking about. I got the opportunity to speak with Underdog Fantasy CEO Jeremy Levine about the whole DFS saga that is happening in the US right now. Charlie, I feel like I've tried to protect you from this because this is a very complicated one in terms of legality. What do you know about kind of the DFS situation in the US?
Yeah, so from a UK perspective, we have season-long fantasy for the Premier League. But you're right. The landscape in the US is completely different. So maybe I just wanted to ask you, really, what is the legal standpoint in the US of daily fantasy sports?
Yeah, so the legal parameters, there's a couple layers to this. Feel like that's how I preface just about everything when it comes to gambling laws in the United States. All right, so quick history lesson for those who don't know. In 2006, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act law was passed, which essentially made it illegal to conduct financial transactions over state lines related to gambling. When that bill happened, there was a lawmaker who was like, hey, I play my fantasy league. I want to be able to keep playing fantasy. I think we shouldn't criminalize fantasy. So they created this fantasy carve out in the language that basically said, this law applies to everything except fantasy sports. And there are some conditions around the fantasy sports. Jeremy goes through them in the interview, but essentially it needs to be based on player statistics. It needs to be a game of skill. It needs to involve more than one individual game. So it can't just be, I'm betting on the entire Chiefs team to do well. You would bet on the Chiefs in one game and, the Bills over in another game. And that created this kind of murky definition of fantasy, which is why roughly 10 years ago, FanDuel and DraftKings came out with this slate style fantasy sports where you kind of pick your team for the week and have a salary that you can only spend X amount on players, and you compete against other people and the highest salary wins. When that happened, there was a huge debate if that counted as gambling or fantasy sports. And there was kind of this first wave of states that came in and regulated DFS. Some didn't. There are still plenty of states that don't. Georgia, Texas, California. But lots of states explicitly decided to legalize and regulate DFS. Now, this second wave of sites, the Prize Picks, the Underdogs, Better Fantasy, it wouldn't be an episode with Charlie and I if we didn't get a better reference in there. They now offer a product that kind of looks more like prop betting, where you'll say, I'm going to decide whether or not Patrick Mahomes' statistical performance is over or under 300 yards passing. And I'm going to be over here deciding if Josh Allen does or doesn't throw for an interception. And I'm going to kind of combine all of these together in a roster that is actually played against the house versus playing against other players. That all under UIGEA, I think, is the way, in their mind, it fits. Where we're getting hairy now is individual states' gambling laws may say things that specifically mention or define fantasy sports in a different manner. And that's why we've seen in Florida that the Florida regulators have sent a cease and desist that actually they've said is applicable to all forms of fantasy, not just this pick'em style. That was a very long explanation, I realize, but does that give you kind of the landscape, Charlie?
Yeah, absolutely. That clears up a lot of things there, and I'm fairly sure it'll help all of the listeners at home. I guess what I wanted to ask, though, following on from that, is because this space has evolved very quickly over the last few years, probably since 2018, and you've talked about the rise of these pick'em style games. Why is it, do you think, that FanDuel and DraftKings are so intent on shutting down these new wave style DFS operators?
So this is where I'm making sure we don't get sued. I am not saying that FanDuel and DraftKings are hell-bent on shutting down this category. Jeremy Levine is saying this. However, at Nickel G's this year in Denver, the FanDuel rep there, Caesar, very adamantly described them as illegal sports books. I think they are on record that they don't like them. If I were FanDuel and DraftKings, I think that the issue isn't so much that this group is eating into their DFS revenue. We've seen that they're making money, substantially more money, in sports betting and in other categories. In online casino, they're making the most money of all, that it's not so much about worrying about DFS. In my interview, Jeremy said, and they've disclosed other places, Underdog is intent on getting into the sports betting space. As he says and argues, I can't contend it or question it because we don't have access to their database. He says they have more users than FanDuel and DraftKings did when they first came into the space. And you see now that they're very clearly 1 and 2 on the back of those users. So if Underdog is getting into these new spaces, getting into sports betting, getting into potentially casino down the way, you never want a competitor coming into the space, but inhibiting their ability to continue gaining users is one thing. I think you also have to look at the burden of coming into states and getting a license from a regulatory perspective is very high, that if you are found to be doing something illegal in another state, it would make your chances of getting a license in that state more complicated. So I would think if you are actually concerned about them as a competitor, it would be beneficial to, 1, limit their ability to earn, and 2, put them in a spot where they, at the risk of potentially not getting a license down the line, have to keep pulling out of states. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of things going on here, and it's interesting to get the lowdown, and especially from Jeremy himself. So it should be a really interesting read.
I'll say this, props to Jeremy. A lot of people, they want to know what you're going to talk about. They don't necessarily agree to answer every question. He was willing to answer anything that I asked him, including what was, not intentionally a loaded question, but a question that I think is at the heart of this. it's very obvious that the argument from Underdog is that fantasy sports is not sports betting. That's very clear, and they're very intent on that. I asked him, is fantasy sports gambling?
$1 million question.
And, his answer was an interesting one. Let me give you verbatim what he said. There was a pause there. He said, great question, long pause. Legally, no. Colloquially, it's for people to determine. If you go to play a game of golf with a friend and bet money on it, is that gambling? If you say yes, you may say that real money fantasy sports are. If you say no, it's probably because, per the terminology of the laws, it's not. And if you say that that is not fantasy sports, and this is kind of how I feel about the whole DFS thing in general, is it's very hard for me personally to draw this line of demarcation of where gambling starts and not gambling stops. I play FanDuel Face Off on my phone. I play this Wheel of Fortune game that is considered a game of skill. But at the end of the day, I'm putting $5 on the line that I can play Wheel of Fortune better than someone else. And to me, at the end of the day, it's gambling, like it's putting money up that I'm going to be better at something than someone else, even if that something is skill-based.
And this is, this shows how murky these waters are, is that Jeremy lives and breathes this. He has done for around a decade. And he there is struggling to draw that line of where, different people's perspectives are on this argument. And for him to be so candid in his answer is great for us. But I think it really shows where the heart of this debate really is.
And this is, too, the heart of the debate is this kind of poorly written piece of law, right? Is that we're not debating whether or not, like, fundamentally it's gambling. We're debating whether or not this terminology, this very specific terminology in this now 20-year-old law satisfies this category or not. And I'll be honest, like, this is everything. This is not just fantasy. There is a reason that people use old horse races to make slot machines and then be like, it's not a slot machine, it's a parimutuel racing experience. If you are held to the letter of the law, which is what we always come back to in these situations, is it to the letter of the law or not? And I think that you could kind of argue. I've heard very sound arguments on either side of it. And it's also state by state really just changes a lot one way or the other. On that note, quick aside. So right now, there's a lot of things happening in the fantasy space. I mentioned Florida, I believe. They have sent they sent cease and desist to Underdog, to Prize Picks, to Better, and some others. And Underdog offers several products besides props, and they wrote back to clarify, do you mean we just need to shut down props, or do you mean everything that we offer? And they said everything. Worth noting, FanDuel and DraftKings did not receive such a letter. But if it's everything, then they would ostensibly be included there. Also worth noting, the one group that has the most control over sports betting in Florida that isn't the government is the Seminole tribe. So not quite clear. Although, DraftKings and FanDuel have donated a lot to a lot of politicians there to try to push to make it so that it wasn't a monopoly. New York, this week, New York legalized fantasy, or explicitly regulated it in 2016 for a long list of reasons, mostly a court case. They actually have never formally promulgated and adopted regs. There was a discussion a couple months ago that the regs need to clearly eliminate this type of prop style fantasy. The regs that they adopted this week seemed to do that. But again, Charlie, I'm going to read you exactly what they said. and you tell me, devoid of the context I have, whether or not you think this is explicitly saying something. Contests shall not be based on proposition betting or contests that have the effect of mimicking proposition betting. Contests in which a contestant must choose, directly or indirectly, whether an individual athlete or single team will surpass an identified statistical achievement, such as points scored, are prohibited.
Yeah, that's very convoluted, vague, and yeah, as you're probably alluding to, it's not really saying anything.
Well, also, I don't know why you would say a single team will surpass when the nature of props is to bet an over and under. So if I bet the under, am I okay because it's not to surpass, it's to go under?
Yeah, this is where arguments could happen in these regulatory meetings.
Yeah. And Prize Picks and Underdog both said, we're going to talk to the Gaming Commission to see where we stand after this, and you don't say that if you don't have something that you're going to bring to the table that, I think most of us have heard what was said in meetings and know kind of the intent of the reg. But reading the reg itself, I can see you have a little bit of room to maneuver. All right, we talked so much about the contentious stuff. There is other stuff in this interview that I think is interesting. In particular, the fact that Underdog is so successful, even in states where if people wanted to sports bet, they could because it's legal there. The tech is a big part of that, where it's just, it's very simple. It's pictures of the players. You hit over under. It's not this Excel spreadsheet looking thing where you're putting together, odds and parlays, and these minus and plus numbers may not make sense to you. But what he also suggested is that all of this tech fundamentally that sports books are using in the US came from Europe. And he just doesn't believe that the European and the American sports betting experience is comparable. Charlie, you've kind of seen enough of the US side and you've grown up on the UK side. Do you think there's some merit to that you guys just think about sports differently than we do?
I definitely think there are, distinct differences between Europe and the US. I think a lot of this stems from the fact that the US is so ingrained in the fantasy sports world, actually, and it's interesting that this is the topic that we've fallen upon today. Because the American bettor, I think, is a lot more data-driven, a lot more stats-driven about these things, thinks about player stats a lot more. In European betting, we don't tend to do lots with player betting. It's more of a new thing. And, we talk about the stats-driven side of it. The most popular sport in Europe is undoubtedly football, soccer. There's not that many actions that you can bet on an individual player compared to some of the American sports. So I think that there's a lot less opportunities to delve into some of those more player-driven markets that the US bettor is used to doing because they play fantasy and they look into these player actions on a weekly basis. So I think there's a lot of merit to that argument that Jeremy's making. And to be fair, on another note, it's something that you actually brought up a few weeks ago when we were talking about phase 2 and phase 3 of the industry, when some of these newer guys come into the market and really make the user experience a lot friendlier. I think in your example, you may be referring to the Amazons of the world and some of those tech companies, but with the UI that Underdog and the likes are coming out with, I think maybe it's a little bit earlier than the phase 3 that we're talking about. I hope that made sense because I touched on a few different points. No, I think
so. Yeah. I think you're right that I love my teams, but I tend to have players on those teams that I really care about more so. And those are who I like to bet. And then I've been playing poker on Sundays, and so I'm sitting at tables with people, and the question for every touchdown will be like, oh, you know, somebody can see the TV and they'll say like Giants scored. The first question is who did it? I need so-and-so, you know, it's very individually driven. Whereas I think as a Sunderland fan, you're just like, who scored? The answer is Sunderland. That's what you are asking fundamentally.
Absolutely. Are we winning? Brilliant. Fantastic.
Yeah. You mentioned kind of next phase movers. Underdog said next year they are looking to get into the sports betting space. Speaking with Jeremy, this did not make the final cut of the interview because, again, it could have gone on, you know, another 4,000 words. He said that he felt like had they just, you know, gone the traditional route, he believes that Underdog would be fourth right now.
Wow.
But you say, wow, when has someone come into this market and not proclaimed that they're going to be fourth, right?
Yeah, to be fair, it would be more startling if he said, yeah, if we make the top 20, we'll be happy.
Yeah, you know, yeah. I think if we did it, we'd probably be around 11th, and that's the goal. Predictions, I know you don't really know Underdog as much. How do you think if they come into the sports betting market, do you think somebody with kind of a fundamentally different look and feel, which is what I think the big selling point is here, that the tech is much more accessible to lay people, think that they can make a dent?
I think that's the fundamental question really, is how good is the product? How good is that user experience? And will it resonate with a sports betting audience? Because, you know, everyone else in the market, bar a couple of the new entrants, they have years and years of experience at this by now, and they've collected all this data on all their players, different behaviors. They can analyze the patterns and know what bets to suggest to players. I think Underdog would really have to make sure that tech and that product is first class in order to make a dent. It would be difficult, but, you know, if they're as confident in the tech as they sound, then, you know, why not?
I've heard from people outside of Underdog that they really enjoy the tech experience. But this is the other thing. If you're in the DFS space, you have a lot more flexibility to do things with your tech, to update, to change, to fine tune. Whereas in a regulated space, you make material changes to your app, you've got to send them to GLI or a testing laboratory and then get them approved. Like, it just, entering into the space, you will inevitably lose some of that flexibility. That's what comes with being regulated. That being said, it does seem like people have responded to this different look and feel. And now I'm going to bring up, you know who I'm going to bring up? You know, Better said, we're going to bring this entirely different version of what it's like to do sports betting. And people did not respond to it. I do think that the tech has a substantial edge over Better's tech, that it does look and feel a lot different, and they've had a lot of time to fine tune it. But we've seen the value prop come in and claim to be the betting app for people who don't know a lot about betting. That I'd be curious. I'm certainly curious. I think they stand just as good a chance as a Fanatics as an ESPN of making a dent, because they are bringing something different to the table. But because we don't know their numbers and we don't know their loyalty, it's very difficult for me to make like a very accurate estimation of necessarily how they're going to translate into a sports betting app. All right, we have used up our time here. And Charlie, I regret to inform you, you're back on your own again next week, because I'm going to be at G2E running myself ragged, moderating a panel Monday, 9 a.m. for those who are going. Please come. It's going to be a panel about our Looking Sharp series. We're basically going to do a live version of that content series that we did on SBC Americas. So by all means, come check it out. In the meantime, on the home front, anything people should keep an eye out for at SBC Americas, besides, of course, going and reading this Underdog interview?
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely do go and read that Underdog interview because, it's going to be great. I mean, an interesting M&A story yesterday, Odds on Compliance and US Integrity, who you've recently spoken to, right?
I interviewed all of them and Prohibit all at once, so not surprised at the news you're about to say.
Yeah, they've announced a merger to basically be a one-stop shop for all things all things compliance and regulatory monitoring and that kind of thing. And then also we heard maybe for the last time something about Barstool, didn't we?
I got to write about them one last time. Yeah. So right now, like, Barstool still exists. I think people kind of forget because there's no promotion around it. Penn's product is still Barstool. Like, it launched here in Kentucky as Barstool. Barstool is now owned by Dave Portnoy. The college football betting show, as a condition of their approval in Massachusetts, needed to be age gated to 21, even in non-Massachusetts appearances. Now that it is Portnoy's, it's all ages. It's no limits, and that is raising some concerns in Massachusetts. If Barstool does come up again, we will certainly be talking about it on SBC Americas. Keep tuning in to SBC Americas next week. Charlie will hold down the home front while I am at G2E. And of course, you need to be tuning in each and every day for a new episode of iGaming Daily.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of iGaming Daily, brought to you in conjunction with SBC Summit Latino America, being held at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Miami on the 31st of October to the 2nd of November. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network. Happy reading.